Hello there. This is an image of Mark Edward Ochterman coming to you wherever you are, whoever you are, and welcome. For me, this evening is what we call Labor Day weekend. It's September 4th, 2022, and I'm responding to a challenge that was presented to look at sections of the synoptic gospels that have to do with either the Gerasene demoniac or the Gadarene demoniacs. And this is not entirely a cold study for me. There are two reasons for that. One is that years long ago, so nearly, I guess we could describe it as cold from this perspective, that in the 1980s, I took a seminar course with David One, and my seminar paper was on exorcistic practices in the New Testament, comparing them to the non-Christian environment of the classical world, Greco-Roman community. And there were certain consistent patterns to ways that exorcism was dealt with. It was how can I put this? It was a common enough affliction that there were standard ways of dealing with it. It was not just a sort of a haphazard approach that was taken. But my study indicated that the approach taken by Jesus and then subsequently his followers, at least his immediate followers, was one that to basically turn the standard practice on its head and did it in a completely other fashion. And whatever may be the sort of ultimate reason for that, one of the effects of the Christian approach to this, or the approach of Jesus, at any rate, had to do with Jesus' authority, which was recognized by the demons, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But so I'm not coming into this completely cold with no prior experience. I have read these pericopes previously, but I haven't looked at them closely for a long time now. And it's also not entirely cold because this past Friday, so today is Sunday for me, so Friday, Saturday, so like 3 days ago. Maybe it was a week ago. Anyway, so sometime relatively recently, I guess it was actually like 10 days ago now, we looked at this passage to try to interpret it from certain theological worlds, perspectives, and I was asked, or my group was asked, to look at this from a perspective of a person who seeks social justice. So I'm going to look at it a little bit more broadly, and particularly from a standpoint of comparing the three accounts that we have that are essentially, it seems like they are essentially using the same material but just presenting it differently. So I'll be making a comparison between them and talking a little bit about how that might be contextualized in each of them. This is part of a series that attempts to present Bible study not as a fait accompli of my own, where hopefully, everybody will say, oh, his interpretation is the best and it's the one, that I'm going to follow, but to be a model for other people to look into such things. So one of the tricks of the trade that I have, and anyone who is really serious about Bible study, where you want to probe the literary qualities of the work as well as the philosophical or theological aspects of the work, and often the two are not really distinct one from the other, because when somebody's writing a philosophical or a theological work, there's the content, but there's also the form, and decisions that are made about how the content is arranged are guided by philosophical and theological considerations. And so this is one of the very interesting things about the Gospels that are now presented, typically Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. There are others, but that those four, the four that are the kind of standards, are distinctly different each from the other, and that they present divergent philosophical, theological positions, and they do it with four quite different literary constructions. So in this particular instance, we do not have a story of a Gadarene or Gerasene demoniac in the Gospel of John, so we have only the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are called the synoptic Gospels because they often use material that came from the same sources. So this text, the synopsis of the four Gospels, is very, you got to be a little hardcore, okay, to want it, to use it, because it's divided between sections that are in the Greek language and those which are in an English translation, and there are many helps that give information about manuscriptival traditions, variant translations. It is pretty hardcore. You don't have to be knowledgeable about all of those manuscript traditions, though, to have benefit from a work like this. And I would just say that, similarly, when one reaches a certain point in looking at the New Testament, inevitably there is a draw, or I think, maybe I shouldn't say inevitably, but for many people I think that there's a draw to looking at the material in Greek. And there are different ways that this can be approached. There's the approach that's like this one, where it's just the Greek text. That's all that you got. But there's a kind of dare I say cheater's version of this in the interlineal. Let's see if I can see the interlinear Bible. Okay, and it's interlineal because it has Greek on one line and what purports to be a literal translation of the Greek beneath it. And, you know, like I said, it's kind of the cheater's edition, but I've got one, so, but here's an example of a page where, okay, so this is the Greek New Testament, and there's the text, and this is all notes. This is all about manuscriptival variations and differences, perhaps, of understanding of how verbs are formed, or how scribes sometimes read things and they think, oh, well, you know, don't they mean this word rather than another? They're very closely similar words. The scribe makes a mistake, or makes the interpretation that he or she makes. I think it was probably mostly he, but you know, we don't want to leave out the possibility. And somehow that variation becomes standardized through a tradition of manuscripts. This is fascinating stuff. It really is, but it's not what I'm going to be approaching tonight. I'm just, you know, kind of illustrating that there is a certain point when you start looking at these things, particularly when you run into one of the points that we're going to see very soon, which is, where is this person from? So, in the parallel Gospels, or the synopsis of the four Gospels, each story is assigned a pericope number, and so some decision making has also been done as to where a story begins and ends, but they're fairly standard determinations. These, for the most part, the works which I've illustrated, the interlinear, that one I think is largely the work by of a single scholar, but with a committee sort of behind it and peer review. The Greek New Testament that I showed you is a committee's production. This work that I'm going to be using as my main text is the product of a committee. And the advantage of that is that there's checks and balances against somebody just deciding, oh, that's, you know, this is what it means, and I know so, and so it is. So here we have, and because of the nature of the research that lies behind this, this comes especially from the work of a man named Kurt Aland. And so it is in part a it's not a translation of Allen's work, but it is work that derives from a work of a German-speaking scholar who also speaks Greek, or reads Greek anyway, or read Greek. So this particular passage, which is from Matthew, the 8th chapter, the 28th through the 34th verse, for those of you following at home. Okay, so what is going on in this passage is described here. This is pericope 91 in this synopsis of the four Gospels, and it's headed demoniaci Gerasene, okay, in Latin. Well, that's delightful. But if you're not up to Latin, at least you're probably up to German, right? So it says, Heilung der Besessenen von Gadara. All right, now we're already into some troubled waters here. But, so, in Latin, we're being told it's demoniaci Gerasene. But in English and German, we're getting the Gadarene demoniacs. Okay. So there's this issue, Gerasene or Gadarene. And as it turns out, it gets even more complicated if you want to pursue that particular rabbit hole, dive down into there. But essentially, this is a reference to a region near to the river Jabbok, or rather between the river Jabbok and the southeastern area surrounding the Sea of Galilee, and bordered on its west by the Jordan, into which the Jabbok flows. This is a region that has a number of cities. Their peculiarity seems to be that the names of the cities start with a G and seem to have some kind of form like Gadara or Gerasene or something along those lines. And I have to say that it doesn't bear a whole lot of significance to the story, except that it is part of a region that was under a Roman administration, and it seems to be a region that had some kind of peculiarities in terms of the faith practice of the area and the ethnic blend of the area. So it is a characteristic region, but that is something that I have to admit I haven't really pursued very deeply. It's so just take anything that I say that seems real specific about that with a grain of salt. This is supposed to be basically cold interpretation, right? So I'm going to skip the Greek for the moment and look at the English, and I will simply read it. This is from, I'm going to read the section from Matthew first, and it's from the second edition of the Revised Standard Version, which is going through several editions, and it now has this sort of an online presence where it's now the new Revised Standard Version with multiple online amendments or corrections. So, but this is the Revised Standard Version. And when he came to the other side, okay, so the other side. I'll come back to that. When he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, Matthew says, Gadarenes, 2 demoniacs met him, coming out of the tombs, so fierce that no one could pass that way. They cried out, "What have you to do with us, O Son of God?" Who knows what they really sounded like. I mean, maybe they're saying, "Yeah, what have you to do with us, O Son of Man?" We don't know. But I like to do it with the death metal demoniacs. So, "What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a herd of many swine was feeding at some distance from them, and the demons begged him, "If you cast us out, send us away into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." And again, I have no idea what Jesus sounded like. I just, it's a monosyllable, so we'll hope that it's respectful. So they came out and went into the swine. And behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the waters. The herdsmen fled, and going into the city they told everything and what had happened to the demoniacs. And behold, all the city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to leave their neighborhood. That's it. That's Matthew's account. All right. Well, he's not giving us a whole lot to work with, really, but it does have this quality that that I had spoken of earlier in the video, which is that typically when there is a demoniac in the Greco-Roman world, in the encounter with a demon-possessed person, the demon has a name. This is how you can control demons, in case you were wondering how to do it. In the ancient world, at any rate, this was a pretty widely accepted understanding, and from it came a fairly widely accepted mode of practice. And we have to recognize that just as today physicians and psychologists and social workers of one sort and another have a whole range of approaches to certain types of problems, just so people in the ancient world, in dealing with demons, had a whole series of different ways of doing it. But the basic technique went something like this. You figured out what was the name of the demon, and there were various kinds of riddle games and different types of things that you could use as diagnostic charts. So today, those who are watching, who are familiar with Dungeons and Dragons monster manuals, or whatever, advanced Dungeons and Dragons, super advanced, totally incredibly advanced, whatever version they're on these days. But the monster manual gives you a diagnostic chart for, am I dealing with a gelatinous cube or a troll? And in the same way, just as we today have Diagnostic and Statistic Manual 5, I think it's the current one, they had Diagnostic and Statistic Manuals, maybe not so much the statistics, but diagnostic manuals that would tell you if the person does this and this, then it probably is demon named such and such. And if the person does this, then it's this one, and so on. There's many lists that you can find. Well, I don't know how many lists you can find, but you can find lists from the ancient world that tell you demons and some of the characteristics that go with those demons, so that you can kind of figure out, okay, so are you this one, or are you that one, or so on. And you better get it right, because if you get it wrong, things can go very badly. But if you get it right, then you can instruct the demon, because you know the demon's name, and that gives you power over the demon. And that, I'm not saying that I don't mean like you go out and practice this. Okay, I'm not advocating this as something to try yourself at home, but I'm merely saying, one, in the ancient world, the one who is attempting an exorcism could do it by this method of saying, demon X, except you say the actual name of the demon, or what you think is the actual name of the demon. To use a fancy term, adjure you, to leave. And if all went well, you could get the demon to leave. Well, then you've got a demon, what do you do with it? So, one method is to trap the demon in a bowl, for example, that has spells on it that will contain the demon there, and then by cracking a little hole in the bowl, the demon is caught. And it's one of the peculiar features of certain archaeological sites of the ancient Middle East, is these bowls with incantations written on them that are apparently were used for exorcistic purpose. You will notice that there's no bowl cracking, there's no name dropping, there's no riddling, none of this. The demons come to Jesus. He's just walking along, minding his own business, and here come these demons running up to him. What have you to do with us? Well, okay. First of all, this is kind of peculiar. So the demons themselves are approaching a being which they recognize. The ordinary human being who encounters Jesus is like, oh, Rabbi, boy, you're a great teacher, or that maybe looking at him in a disparaging way. But the demons recognize his authority, and they recognize him as being the Son of the Most High, or Son of God. Okay? So, have you come here to torment us before the time? And this is interesting, because there were a number of passages where Jesus says, my time has not yet come. Don't tell anybody, because it's not the right time. So, although we don't know maybe what the time is, what that is supposed to mean, or what it means for Matthew anyway, or what it meant for the demons, they seem to think that there's a time when they could expect that the Son of God would harass them. And it's not time yet. We're still having fun, causing these people to have all kinds of troubles. Why are you bothering us? Jesus says nothing. No one could pass that way. They cried out, what have you to do with us? You come to torment us. And then, just at this moment, apropos of nothing, except that the swineherders are driving their swine along. The demons see the swine and they're, oh, if you cast us out, send us into that herd of swine. Why not? So Jesus says, go. And they go. They go into the swine run down into the sea, they drown. End of story. Well, not quite. Now, as Matthew tells the story, and he tells it very sparingly, which is kind of unusual for Matthew. Matthew usually is a little more wordy and brings in, and he says, this is to fulfill the prophecy or whatever. But in this particular case, he's got the most stripped down version of this story that any of the synoptics tell. Usually my vote would be for Mark being the stripped down one, but in this case it's Matthew. We basically hear nothing more about the demoniacs. So these people who had these demons and no one could get past them, they were so fierce that no one could pass that way. There were demoniacs coming out of the tombs, so inhabiting the tombs, I guess. What tombs? It doesn't matter, just the tombs. So, the demoniacs come out, the demon-possessed people. The swine happily come along at just this opportune moment. Jesus says, go. So the demons go into the swine. Well, so presumably the demoniacs don't have demons anymore. We don't know. Matthew doesn't really say. It's just implied. Okay, it's a little strange. The herdsmen fled. So the swineherds fled, going into the city, which I presume is Gadara. But country of the Gadarenes, so the city of the Gadarenes, I guess is where they went. They went into the city, they told everything, and what had happened to the demoniacs. Okay, so everything doesn't include what happened to the demoniacs, according to Matthew. Everything was the swine running into the sea and drowning. And, oh yeah, and there were these demoniacs. Okay. That's the last that we hear about the demoniacs in Matthew's story. We don't hear a single word about them again. But the people came out of the city. Everyone came out of the city. All the city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to leave their neighborhood. Okay, so let's try to get an understanding here of what's going on. I think that it's fairly well known, but maybe not everyone who's watching knows that as a commonplace at any rate, pig flesh is not consumed by observant Jews. Okay, I hope that's not a surprise to observant Jews who might be watching, and my apologies for the levity. But it's a typical feature of Jewish dietary law that certain animals are clean, are considered to be clean, and therefore may be consumed, and there's certain animals that are unclean. That's how we usually render trefa, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but trefa are unclean. They're not to be eaten. And it's a whole range of foods that are unclean foods, but there's also a very wide range of foods that are clean foods. And this is, it's not absolutely this, but most vegetable foods are clean and are fine. And we can't really think of an example of a vegetable food that's not clean. But animal foods fall into two categories, clean and unclean, and pigs are in the unclean side. There are lots of others, I'm not going to belabor that. But for some reason, in this country, which is in the general region in which there are a lot of Jews living, there are swine herds with a herd large enough to accommodate however many demons were in these demoniacs. Now, there were two demoniacs, so you suppose, well, you know, it's probably at least two demons. But we have reason to suppose, as we look at this story in other versions of it, that there may be something more to this. And this is where comparison of the different Gospels gives you a fuller picture of what any one of them may have to say. And particularly when you have the same, what seems to be the same passage or the same story that's told by several different authors. You know, might be Mark and Matthew, Mark and Luke, Matthew and Luke, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three. Every once in a while, John chimes in and adds something. Sometimes it's just Luke and John, sometimes it's just Mark and John, sometimes it's just Matthew and John. Trying to think of instances where those would be the cases, but usually it's the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics, who are colluding with each other, and maybe not actually colluding with each other, but using much of the same material, but they each have distinctive material of their own. So, all right. And I'm just reiterating something that I'd already said. Okay, so Gadarene demoniacs, as Mark tells the story. Now, Mark tells the story, for those of you following at home, in chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. And I'll just read it to you. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. All right. I'm not just going to read it because it's going to get caught up on some other things. But Matthew tells us when he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes. All right. To the other side of what I said at the beginning. Okay, well, Mark helps us out. He says, when they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. So what we have to do to understand, obviously, where they were, is to read the passage that came before. So what came before Matthew 8:28 through 34, or rather what came before Matthew 8:28, and in Mark's case, what came before Mark 5:1. All right, but just looking at this pericope, right? So Mark wrote, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had come out of the boat, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been bound with fetters and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the fetters he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and bruising himself with stones. Well, that's a lot more information than Matthew gave us, for sure. It does seem that they're working from the same material, and it makes you, and there's more to the story in Mark, but I'll just pause for a second and say, they're clearly working from the same material, but Matthew seems to only have like a bare bones synopsis. Oh, there was this thing with the demoniac and the pigs. Okay. Mark is giving us a lot more content, a lot more detail. And for Mark, this is kind of exciting because Mark is usually pretty sparing. But, so night and day among the tombs, on the mountains, he was always crying out and bruising himself with stones. Thus the person with the unclean spirit. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." Well, this is a bit of a puzzler, all right, because there's a man with an unclean spirit. And the man with the unclean spirit runs to Jesus and worships him. That seems pretty straightforward. I mean, like, I can understand that. Somebody sees Jesus and they run to him and they worship him. You know, today, in the 21st century, like, if you saw Jesus walking towards you, wouldn't you run and worship him? Well, you might. But how would you know that it was Jesus? How would you know that it was the Son of the Most High God? So, a real question that has to be raised is, who's doing the running? Who's doing the worshiping? Is it the man or the unclean spirit? Is there a distinction between them? In other words, is this a man who has an unclean spirit that's a separate thing, that's come into him, that's possessing him, that's, so to speak, occupying him? Or is it he's got a complex? He's got like a psychological complex. It's just a guy, and he really needs some psychotherapy, and it's just him. There's no demon, because demons are myths. But he has this kind of, you know, wacky ideation that's a little bit off, that causes him to bruise himself with stones and rip fetters to pieces and undo chains. You know, so he's got like extreme strength and tenacity, and but you know, it's a complex. Right? And one of the things that's very interesting about this, about the passage from Mark specifically, Matthew, you know, they're demoniacs, and they're not really even characters. You can hardly relate to these adversaries, or whatever you want to call them, the characters in Matthew's telling, you can hardly relate to them at all. But this guy, this is conflicted. This is an interesting character. So he's clearly got a problem. All right. So there's a human being. It's a single human being. He lives in the tombs, and he runs around in the tombs and on the mountain. People try to restrain him. It doesn't work. I'm just reiterating all of this, since, you know, that's what Bible commentators do, right? They just keep saying the same thing over. So, okay. But what's interesting about it is that you don't know. You can't tell from Mark what exactly his psychological, psychotherapeutic, theological position is. What is the relationship between the unclean spirit and the man? Is it that the man's spirit, his own spirit, the spirit of the man, has somehow become unclean? Or is he possessed by an unclean spirit that came from outside of him, and that has somehow done a mind meld with him, you know, to use kind of contemporary science fiction parlance? We don't know. What's fascinating about this passage is how in fact at the same time multiple interpretations can be equally valid, can be equally true. And that's true of very many passages. This is a nice rich one because we have these different aspects of the way that the story is told. So, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Oh, and if you want to read this straight through, just get a copy of the Bible and read the darn thing straight through. Read it straight through. Sorry for those of you who don't like replacement swear words. What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. Oh, wow. I mean, you know, I just said, look, this is an ambiguous kind of thing, but the unclean spirit, it would seem that the unclean spirit is saying, I call upon God, you're the Son of the Most High God, okay? Jesus, Son of the, he knows his name. The spirit, or the demoniac, or whatever, this person in the tombs, knows Jesus' name. How did he know his name? But he says, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. Okay, that's kind of freaky. But I adjure you, so I call to you out of a kind of legal binding not to torment me. I call upon God to keep you from tormenting me. Now this smacks of the Beelzebub controversy, okay, which is a completely other passage, but you know, to do a rich study of this particular passage, you would want also to look at the Beelzebub controversy, which is to be brief, it has to do with people saying of Jesus that, oh, he casts out demons in the name of the Prince of Demons. And, you know, Jesus says, well, okay, that's kind of strange. Because house divided and so on. So, we'll see whether I run out of recording space or whether I can get to that one. So, the reason that unclean spirit, whether it's native or whether it's an invader of the man, the reason that it says, I adjure you by God, do not torment me, Mark tells us why. For, meaning because, he, meaning Jesus, so because Jesus had said to him, the man with the unclean spirit. So, because Jesus had said to the man with the unclean spirit, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And again, we are left with, all right, is the unclean spirit an invader? Is the unclean spirit a growth, like a cancer, in a sense, a cancer of the mind? Is it something that has developed in the person? Is it complex? Okay, it's native to the person, to the ego of this individual. It has been generated within the person, or is it something from outside? In a sense, it really doesn't matter. But in another sense, we kind of like to know. But Mark does not make it clear which of the two it is. But Jesus has told him, come out of him, you unclean spirit. To which the response is, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. Now, this kind of blows my earlier thesis, which is that Jesus' typical way of dealing with exorcisms is that the demon recognizes him, recognizes him as Jesus, recognizes Jesus as being the Son of the Most High God, Son of David, Son of God, something along those lines, and that he, Jesus, has authority over the spirits. This is a general thing that the spirits recognize, because why wouldn't they understand? Why wouldn't they recognize their prince, or the one who has power over them? They may be very uncomfortable with him, they don't like him, it's not their time yet, they're still having their fun, but they recognize him. And here we have, it's laid out strangely in Matthew, or in Mark rather, because first we have the reaction, and then we have the reason for the reaction. But because we have it in that sequence, that first we have what Mark lines up as being a reaction, because Mark presents that first, we do have this kind of temporality to it, that if you had been there and watched this event occurring, it might be, in fact, that Jesus, kind of like mentally, the second that the demoniac appears, shrieking and bruising himself with stones, or whatever it is that he was doing, Jesus is already, asserting his authority and grasping onto the spirit. This is one way that we could possibly understand what's going on. But physically, words don't come out of his mouth until after the person with the unclean spirit is declaring, I adjure you by the Most High God, or so on, do not torment me. Okay. So the sequence is a little strange, and that it has to do, as much as anything else, with the wording. And I did say that I wouldn't use Greek, but I will use Greek. So, elegain gar auto. Elegain, he had said. Okay, so it's something that had happened. I'm bad on perfect and past perfect, whatever, but it's an expressive elegane is something that has already happened. Gar means, well, it's being rendered here in the Revised Standard Version as for. I think that I have often thought of it as meaning then, like subsequently. So I'll have to look into that. And the way that I look into that, more than anything else, is that I grab my handy dandy and apparently unavailable, where could it possibly be, Greek-English lexicon, which seems to have wandered over here from where it usually is. And so I will look up the word gar, which is Gamma Alpha Rhoda, which puts it near the beginning. And I am going to be corrected in my interpretation. So, gar is a conjunction for, in English for, Latin enim, and like it placed after the first word in a sentence. So, elegane, gar, auto, which just means to him. Okay. Its chief usages are to introduce the reason. When the reason precedes that of which it is the reason, it may be rendered by since or as. Or to strengthen a question, like the Latin nam or English why, what. So the example that's given is Tisgar say Achan, why who hath sent thee? Who hath sent thee? Why? Who hath sent thee? I'm trying to think of 21st century English. Why? Whatever is the matter? You know, it's sort of something along those lines. So it's a strengthening. And that is kind of, to me, that does seem to be what, the way that Mark is using it, rather than to set up a to suggest that it is because Jesus said this that the demon said to him, I adjure you by God, do not torment me. It may also strengthen a wish. So the example is given, kakos gar exoloio, which of course is very meaningful to you at home. Oh, that you might perish. Like, oh that, Husgar, would that, you know, whatever. Okay, so I stand somewhat corrected. I'm not sure that then ever in English is really going to do that. Here, of course, is the danger, and a very considerable danger, of being a sort of sophomore in your Bible studies and holding it unchecked. Okay, so I could present this and I could say, oh yes, usually I render gar is then, which I do, but that might also explain why I got B's and C's in my Greek classes. It is useful to have a lexicon, which is basically Greek-English dictionary. They call it lexicon. There are numerous of them. I usually use Liddell and Scott, which is this one. This happens to be an earlier edition. I have another one that just literally fell apart, and I have to rebind it. But it's a more recent edition. And there are others. Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich is widely available, and there's another person who's been involved in it. I don't know what happened to my copy of that. That has completely disappeared into the netherworld of boxes that haven't been opened yet. I'm hoping that I didn't give it away, because it is in fact quite a useful work, but I'm kind of thinking that when I divested myself of many books in the about 8 years ago, I think that might have been one that went on the argument that it's online, that I could get it online, but I do like having these things as print works for doing the kind of thing that I'm doing right now. Okay, so much for gar. We'll leave that for the moment. Okay, so the story of this guy, bruising himself with stones, breaking fetters, dissolving the chains, etc. So he comes to Jesus, and Jesus says, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. Now, there's been some ambiguity here already. We've got we don't know what is the nature of the unclean spirit's relationship to the man, to the ego of the man, the soul of the man. We don't know. We're not specially enlightened, we're not gaining clarity, okay, by the unclean spirit calling upon God to stop Jesus from tormenting him. And I think that's a very interesting thing that happens there. And now, Mark 5:9, Mark writes, and Jesus asked him, what is your name? Or, what is your, again, how is the emphasis supposed to be placed upon this passage? It's hard to know, but if we try to do it really flat, and we say, and Jesus asked him, what is your name? He replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. Okay. Now, this is a passage that has been taken up and used in supernatural horror films, okay? I think that there's even a television series that made use of this. And at a certain point, you kind of get used to it and you're not really thinking about what a very, very strange expression or series of expressions are here. Okay, so Jesus asks him, what is your name? And in Greek, okay, he's speaking to a single individual. And given what happened with Gar, I'm sure you're saying, oh, you don't know the first thing about Greek. But he says, T, that is to say, what, okay, onoma, which means name, and pretty fairly straightforward, what we mean by name. Like, what is the assignment that by which I may address you? Soy. And this, in English, if we were careful about these things, we would say is thou, or actually thy. So what is thy name? What is you, just the one of you, not group of you, and familiar, not formal or polite. Okay, this is the familiar form. So what is your name? What is thy name? And he replies, my name, okay, so legion onoma moi, my name. He says legion onoma moi. My name is Legion, because we are many. It actually is even like a funny little, almost like a rhyme. Okay, so ti onoma soi, kai legon oto, legion onoma moi, hoti poloi esme. Because we are many. Poloi, many. Alright. This is terribly confused. Okay? But we're asking a question about a single individual who is responding that my name is Legion because we're many. We are many. That's such a puzzler, I'm just going to go forward with the rest of the story. My name is Legion, for we are many. And he, okay, this is where things get a little hazy again, or where things stay a bit hazy, okay, it says, he begged him eagerly not to send them out of the country. And it's not any more clear in the Greek. Okay. So he begged him eagerly not to send them out of the country. One way that we could interpret this line, okay, is that he, the man with the unclean spirit, begged Jesus, eagerly not to send them, Legion, the unclean spirits, out of the country. And I'm going to stick with that one because the rest of it makes a lot more sense if you use that. But I think other interpretations are possible, but not necessarily really strongly tenable. All right, and I think that that's pretty much the standard one, what I just said. So that the man with the unclean spirit asked Jesus not to send the legion of unclean spirits out of the country. Now the story becomes a familiar one to us. Now, a great herd of swine was feeding there on the hillside. And, okay, so at least that. So, a great herd of swine feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, and I think the standard way of guessing what this means is that the legion of unclean spirits, or the unclean spirit that calls itself legion and wants to be addressed as they, begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them," the swine. So he gave them leave. All right, no, all right. Here again, we've got some. This is peculiar in so many ways. Of course, it's peculiar to a scientific 21st century mind because it's like, okay. So now let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that this man with the unclean spirit has, a psychological complex. Like, if we just grabbed him and took him into some Jungian art therapy, we could get him all straightened out. And, but Jesus gives permission for the unclean spirits to go into the swine. All right, well, that, in a certain sense, this does make sense because the swine are already unclean animals, so why not put unclean spirits in unclean animals? I mean, if they're going to have spirits, they might as well be, birds of a feather flock together, or unclean spirits flock in unclean animals, or some such thing. So off they go. The unclean spirits came out of the man with the unclean spirit. Okay, now notice that at the beginning of the story there was a man with an unclean spirit. And that's in the Greek it doesn't quite work out that way. So this is one of those instances where you're like, okay, no. How did we end up with a man with an unclean spirit when we have en plumati akatharto, en plumati akatharto. It doesn't mean, well, it means akatharto is unclean, okay, and pneumati is the spirit, the breath, right? Is bad breath. This is not really what it means, but there's a man, anthropos, and pneumati akatharto, a man in spirit unclean. A man in spirit unclean. Now, actually, poetically, okay, if you're thinking about this in a poetic context, how can I render this? authentically, but also beautifully in English, a man in a spirit unclean. It's kind of nice. You know, scans pretty well. A man in a spirit unclean. And that would be a pretty close rendering of the Greek. Or actually, what would be even better, more authentic to the Greek, would be a man in spirit unclean. A man in spirit unclean. Why not? Because maybe somebody has read English that way other than me. So what happens next? Okay, so the unclean spirits came out. All of a sudden there are a bunch of them because they declared themselves, and entered into the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the man who had the legion, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it told what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine. Which Matthew also tells us had happened, but you know, it's like, well, yeah, well, the swine anyway, and then there was the guy with the demoniac. Matthew doesn't tell us anything about it being in his right mind or doing anything. The other thing is, let's consider this. Okay, so the herdsmen go off, they go to the city and the country, and they tell everybody what has happened, which must have taken some time. I mean, I don't think that they could have done it instantly, you know, even if they had had a Twitter feed, they wouldn't have gotten to everybody that quickly. I mean, even if it was a really small city and the country was not that big, it would have taken them a while to do it. So let's figure at a very, very, very conservative estimate of the amount of time that it would take. It would be, you know, a couple hours anyway. So Jesus is sitting around with the demoniac. The demoniac's sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And I mean, I have the sense that, you know, like he and Jesus are just kind of having a chat. You know, meanwhile the herdsmen are running around, telling everybody in the city, telling everybody in the country. This is going on for a while, and Jesus is hanging out with this guy. Talking? Are they talking? Are they just sitting there? Are they enjoying each other's company? Mark doesn't tell us, but they're sitting there, and somehow this guy, who apparently, it actually does not specify that he's naked. There are some incidents in the Bible where a person who is demon possessed is running around naked, but this is not specified in either the account given by Matthew or the account given by Mark. So it's interesting that Mark feels that he needs to specify that the man is clothed and in his right mind, the man who had the legion, and the people were afraid. Okay, so went off, got the people, brought them back. And those who had seen it told what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their neighborhood, which is more or less what Matthew tells us. And Mark goes on, Mark 5:18 and following, and as he was getting into the boat, Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons, plural, begged him that he might be with him. So, I mean, they were sitting together, and I'm thinking, talking to each other, maybe mind to mind, soul to soul, but communicating with each other in some way. And the man has been righted. Okay, he is no longer in pneumati, akatharton. Okay, he's not in a spirit unclean. He's in his right mind. Kathamenon. Okay. Ton daimonizomenon kathamenon. Sophronunta. I am terrible at pronouncing Greek. I'm so sorry. Okay, so Sophronunta. Sophronymy is having prudence, having wisdom. Sophos or Sophia is wisdom, and Sophrosune is prudence. So he's Sophronunta, having a wise mind, is having a rational mind that's capable of wise decision making. Okay, so I don't usually excise sections of these videos, but I'm kind of thinking that, when I get into trying to deal with the Greek, and my Greek is not really that good, okay, but this is also part of my point, that how are you going to get to the point where the Greek is going to be accessible to you, where you're going to be able to make use of the Greek if you don't try to do it? And you try to do it, and you're going to screw up, unless you're very, very good at learning languages, which I'm not. So you muddle along. You muddle along as well as you can. You muddle along in the English, you muddle along in the Greek. Okay. But with or without the use of a lexicon, one tries to parse out, if you're attempting to look at the Greek, try to figure out what is this English phrase rendering from the Greek. And you do find some interesting points. So this the word that's rendered in his right mind is sophronunta. And this has two main elements to it. It's a compound word in Greek, that the soph part of it implies wisdom, and the noon part, or nous, means mind. So he has a rational mind. Now, did he always have a rational mind? This brings us back to these curious questions about what it means to be a person with an unclean spirit. What does it mean to be a person in his right mind? Had he always a right mind, but the demons crowded it and compressed it and pushed it to the side? Or did he have a mind that was a right mind that got kind of corrupted internally and produced these demons, and then the demons are cast out, but they were products of the mind itself that had ceased to be right or wise? It makes some difference theologically, okay? It makes some difference metaphysically. Mark is quite ambiguous about it, and I don't think that you're going to get, an absolute, unqualified determination of which it is. It's certainly possible to read this passage that a foreign body or foreign bodies has entered the man. And I'm indicating head because that's where we think of it as being, but it'd be hard to do wherever. This person somehow in his soul being has been infested by outside forces. That's one interpretation. But another interpretation is that he himself has created these other beings that have now been cast out. And I see that I'm almost out of power in the video machine, so I better wrap this up, eh? They began to beg Jesus to depart from their neighborhood, which is what the man had begged him not to have the legion do. So there's an interesting kind of parallelism there. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him, but he, Jesus, refused. And he said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all men marveled. Well, I'll come back to that if I have an opportunity to return to this, sort of a cold exegesis of the story of the Gadarene, Gerasene, demoniac, demoniacs. Are there more than one? We'll find out in the next thrilling episode.